Welcome to the second part of the instant impact video. Let's continue. So we are now looking at possibilities and solutions for each scenario. Number 1. Your critically ill loved one is going through a long and burdensome stay in intensive care and is going to fully recover. This usually takes time and may require rehabilitation in a rehabilitation facility after the hospital stay. Okay, in our particular scenario and example, with your critically ill loved one in intensive care with severe head injuries, rib fractures and a fractured pelvis or hip, the doctors and the nurses are cautiously optimistic and they think that your critically ill loved one will stay in intensive care for a considerable period of time, maybe a few weeks or maybe even 1 month or more, and they think that your loved one will very likely make a full recovery. That's great news. It will be a long road to recovery, but you are already thinking in your mind that you will do whatever it takes. That's a great starting point and a good attitude to have. So, your critically ill loved one is very likely facing many weeks of acute and intensive treatment in intensive care with high-level nursing care. He or she is likely to require mechanical ventilation, and he or she may require a tracheostomy to facilitate smooth ventilation, and your critically ill loved one may require surgery for his pelvis or hip fracture and for his fractured shin bone. The intensive care team is also positive that your critically ill loved one will recover from their severe head injury. Those are the facts, and that's great news. Now, you and your family can brace yourself for long hours in intensive care, which will cost you time and energy. But once again, you are prepared to do whatever it takes and you can make arrangements. So, what do you want out of this situation? You are relieved that your critically ill loved one is on his or her way to recovery, and you can foresee that the next few weeks are going to be stressful. Besides the doctors and nurses facilitating the treatment and recovery of your critically ill loved one, are you happy about the treatment, and are you happy with how things are handled? Are you happy with how the intensive care team is dealing with you and your family? Are you regularly updated with events and your loved one's progress? Do you and your family feel safe? And do you feel like your critically ill loved one is in the best possible hands? If you can confidently answer yes to all of those questions, great. If you can't confidently say yes to all of those questions, think again. What can be improved? What can be done better? Is it communication? Is it the level of medical or nursing care? Is it the room or bed space that your critically ill loved one is in? Would there be a better room or better bed space for your critically ill loved one to be in, maybe with more natural daylight once he or she is more awake? Do you feel like one particular doctor or one particular nurse is not giving your critically ill loved one the attention and the treatment they need and deserve? Don't think that because your critically ill loved one is going to recover, and because you think that most doctors and nurses are working towards achieving that goal, that there aren't things that can't be improved. There are lots of things happening behind the scenes that you are unaware of, and those things may impact on the time frame and the speed of your loved one's recovery. For example, theatre or surgery time for your loved one may get delayed or cancelled. If that's the case, keep asking why the delay or cancellation, and keep pushing and keep asking. Very few people do ask or do push, but if you do, see what happens and notice the difference. Don't be afraid and be courageous. See and find out what you can influence. Don't be afraid, it can make all the difference. In the second part of our example, where your critically ill loved one is going through a long and burdensome stay in intensive care and will be left with some impairments or he or she may be left with a permanent disability. Your critically ill loved one's recovery will take time and may require some out-of-hospital rehabilitation as well. The intensive care team also thinks that a good quality of life is possible despite the impairment or disability. Okay, in this particular scenario, you have of course hoped for more and for better news, and you hoped and wished that your critically ill loved one would actually make a full recovery. Despite getting bad news that your critically ill loved one is not going to fully recover, you are of course relieved that he or she is going to survive, as you were obviously very concerned that your critically ill loved one would not survive the ordeal. The doctors and the nurses have told you that your critically ill loved one will need to spend a long time in intensive care, and it will take time to get your critically ill loved one out of ICU. You have taken the good and the bad news in, and you are prepared to put up with the long hours in intensive care, and you can make arrangements to organize your and your family's life around it. In terms of the impairment your critically ill loved one is facing, the intensive care team has told you that your critically ill loved one will very likely take a long time to be able to walk again. They are concerned that with the severity of the pelvis fracture and the shin bone fracture, that your loved one may limp when back on their feet, and they may end up with a stiff leg. That's a massive shock for you and for your family, let alone for your critically ill loved one once they are awake. Your critically ill loved one loves being active, loves sport, running and all kinds of other activities. Whilst you and your family are relieved that your critically ill loved one is going to survive, you don't know how to react to those news. What do? How do you react? What can you control in such a situation? It's a difficult question, and once again it ties right in with instant impact strategy number 1 and instant impact strategy number 3. And you need to stare reality in the eye, and you need to acknowledge your fears, your frustrations, your vulnerability and your struggles. Once you have done that, you can then deal more effectively with the situation at hand. So, your critically ill loved one is facing this disability or impairment once they are out of intensive care, and you and your family of course are scared of how your loved one might cope or react to this impairment or disability. What will it mean to your loved one? What will it mean for you and your family? Whilst you can't answer those questions for sure at this point in time, you can certainly think ahead and try and implement strategies so that once your loved one wakes up in intensive care and needs to face the impairment or disability part, that you give them their unconditional love, your full attention and full support. Know what that looks like. You know your critically ill loved one best, and you know what he or she needs and responds to. Make sure that your critically ill loved one gets good physiotherapy and early mobilization. Don't waste any time. The sooner your critically ill loved one will be back on his or her feet, the better it is, and the better and the quicker your loved one will recover and deal with the adversity. Research has shown that people with disabilities, even when diagnosed with paraplegia or quadriplegia, are going back to the same level of happiness than before they have acquired the disability. So be positive and control the things that you can control. Also, don't forget your loved one is alive, and that's a great thing. Besides the intensive care team facilitating the treatment and recovery of your critically ill loved one, are you happy about the treatment, and are you happy with how the things are handled? Are you happy with how the doctors and the nurses are dealing with you and your family? Are you regularly updated with events and your loved one's progress? Do you and your family feel safe? And do you feel like your critically ill loved one is in the best possible hands? If you can confidently answer yes to all of these questions, great. If you can't confidently say yes to all of these questions, think again. What can be improved? What can be done better? Is it communication? Is it the level of medical or nursing care? Is it the room or bed space that your critically ill loved one is in? Would there be a better room or bed space for your critically ill loved one to be in? Maybe with more natural daylight once he or she is more awake. Do you feel like one particular doctor or one particular nurse is not giving your critically ill loved one the attention and the treatment they really need? Don't think that because your critically ill loved one is going to survive, and because you think that most doctors and nurses are working towards achieving that goal, that there aren't things that can't be improved. There are a lot of things happening behind the scenes that you are unaware of, and those things may impact on the time frame and the speed of your loved one's recovery. For example, theatre or surgery time for your loved one may get delayed or cancelled. If that's the case, keep asking why the delay or cancellation, and keep pushing and keep asking. Very few people do ask or do push, but if you do, see what happens and notice the difference. Don't be afraid and be courageous. See and find out what you can influence. Don't be afraid, it can make all the difference. Now, number 3 in our example is, if your critically ill loved one is actually going to approach his or her end of life, how would you like that to occur? Is there enough time to keep your critically ill loved one alive until you and your family had enough time to say goodbye? Is there enough time to make sure that your families and your critically ill loved ones' cultural, spiritual and religious needs have not only been considered but also met? Is there enough time to get other relatives and or friends to say goodbye, or do you need more time for other relatives to come in from overseas or interstate? If your critically ill loved one is approaching their end of life in intensive care, you want to make sure that you and your family have as much peace of mind as possible in this situation, as the memories of the event will stay with you for the rest of your life. Depending on your and your critically ill loved one's situation, can you negotiate more time to keep your critically ill loved one alive until all those wishes have been fulfilled? Remember, a lot of things in life are negotiable, and you need to keep asking for what you and your family want. If your critically ill loved one is actually approaching their end of life, it is a once-in-a-lifetime situation, and as sad and as devastating this situation is, you and your family want to have peace of mind. Furthermore, the health professionals in intensive care want to do their best, and you want to influence as much as you possibly can, so that your critically ill loved one who is approaching their end of life can have a private and dignified death, surrounded by you, by your family and friends when the time has come. I have seen so many families over the years in intensive care asking for and influencing far too little, and they have left the decision making up to the intensive care team, and they have often been very disappointed in how the end of life situation has been handled. Therefore, be very clear and be very specific how you and the rest of your family would like that end of life situation to look like. It could mean that you want your critically ill loved one to go into a quiet side room or into a quieter area in the intensive care unit, because you might feel that the area or the bed space that your critically ill loved one occupies might not be the right spot or area for an end-of-life situation. Specifically, ask if your loved one can be moved into a quieter area. Usually, this is something that can be facilitated if you ask for it. If the intensive care team says that it can't be facilitated, be persistent and keep asking. Don't take no for an answer. Also, keep in mind, you, your families and your critically ill loved one's situation is unique. If your critically ill loved one is approaching the end of life in intensive care, you want to make sure that you and your family have as much peace of mind as possible in this sad and devastating situation, as the memories of the event will stay with you for the rest of your life. Therefore, you and your family don't want to have any regrets, and you don't want to think about this situation in the future in any way that you could have negotiated a better end-of-life situation, because those memories will stay with you and your family forever, and you don't want to think or feel like you have been pushed or rushed into an end-of-life situation that could have been handled much better. Therefore, I really urge you to make your wishes known to the intensive care team. You can trust me on this one. I have seen many good and many bad end-of-life situations in intensive care over the many years. With good end-of-life situations, I mean situations where there has been enough time to get everybody to agree how a particular end-of-life situation should be handled. End-of-life situations that have been handled well usually consider that all the important family members and friends had enough time to say their goodbyes, and usually all the cultural, spiritual, ethical and religious needs of the patient and the family had been considered and met as well. I really do believe that if you can facilitate such a process in a consensual, sensitive, timely, ethical, private and dignified manner, an end-of-life situation can be a tremendous privilege. I really mean it. Whilst it is extremely sad and devastating to lose a precious life, you, your families, as well as the intensive care team's memories of your critically ill loved one's end-of-life situation is extremely important for the rest of your life. Those memories stay with you for the rest of your life, just like many end-of-life situations in intensive care stay with me for the rest of my life. I do remember some very poorly handled end-of-life situations in intensive care, and those poorly handled end-of-life situations stick with me negatively for the rest of my life, let alone the family. How bad must they feel if it leaves a big impact and bad memories on non-family members like myself? I have learned from those poorly handled end-of-life situations, and I have come to the conclusion that there are situations where everybody involved in the process can facilitate and improve the end-of-life process so that everybody knows and everybody agrees we have done the best we could have done for your critically ill loved one in intensive care, and he or she had a private and dignified death so that you, your family and the intensive care team have peace of mind. Therefore, it is important that you and your family have an idea and a clear picture of what that dignified end-of-life situation for your loved one looks like for you and for your family, and simply ask for it. Don't underestimate the significance of this once-in-a-lifetime situation for you and for your family, because you will live with the memories of the situation for the rest of your life. Don't take no for an answer from the intensive care team, and I would think that most intensive care units will move heaven and earth to facilitate your wishes of a dignified and private death for your loved one. Let's look at number 4 of our example. Dealing with the worst case scenario. Number 4. Your critically ill loved one may be so unwell and unstable because of the severe nature of their injuries that they are rapidly approaching their end of life, and their life may be slipping through the fingers of everyone quickly, and he or she may pass away relatively quickly within few hours or few days. Okay, so this is possibly the worst out of all scenarios and the worst situation to be in, because you feel like you have no control at all. The life of your critically ill loved one is slipping through the doctors, the nurses, through your and your family's hands. If you are finding yourself in this situation, I do feel your pain, and I do feel your despair. You might feel numb and you might feel empty. There are not many more challenging situations that life can throw at you than this one. Once again, I have seen those situations as well, where all the efforts to save your critically ill loved one's life are in vain, and it has a massive impact on your and on your family's life. Losing a loved one in such tragic and traumatic circumstances is just simply horrible. Because I have witnessed and I have been involved in such dramatic and tragic end-of-life situations where a precious life literally slips through the fingers of the intensive care team, despite all the technology and life support equipment available. It has left deep impacts and imprints on me as well, as I had to find my own coping strategies of dealing with such dramatic circumstances beyond everyone's control. If you have lost a loved one in intensive care due to critical illness, or if you are about to lose a loved one due to critical illness, look at the situation and ask yourself, is there meaning in this? I know you might think I have lost it, but I say this again. Is there meaning in the death of your loved one? I know that whenever I have lost a loved family member who died, I found out the deeper meaning behind it. I found that there usually was a lesson that the rest of the family had to learn from. They were lessons that were hard to swallow at first, and once you have come clear with those lessons, you might find meaning in it. Is there a lesson in the death of your loved one that the rest of your family needs to understand and learn from? It could be personal as well.